Welcome to Episode 7 of The Making of Pakistan, Unpacking the Roots of a Nation. In this deep dive, we explore Chapter 6 of K.K. Aziz's seminal work, where the psychological foundations of Muslim separatism take center stage. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. We've looked at the history, the culture, politics, all the sort of tangible pieces.
Right.
But this chapter, Chapter 6, it really shifts focus. It gets right into the mind of it all. Aziz basically argues that the feeling, this belief in separateness, well, that was maybe the most powerful factor driving things.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how he talks about patriotism and nationalism. He's saying they're not just about, land or language, the stuff you can point to. Fundamentally, he says, it's the state of mind. It's almost a spiritual feeling, kind of like faith, actually.
Faith, wow.
And he suggests that sometimes this feeling, this conviction, is even more important than the historical facts or the cultural ingredients. He puts it quite strongly. You just can't argue with a people's feeling that they're separate, even if, looking from the outside, you don't quite see the basis for it in the way they do.
That really makes you pause, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He even brings in Renan.
Yes.
Who basically said, look, if people feel passionately that they're a nation, well, history and just plain common sense say you kind of have to accept that.
Pretty much. It becomes its own reality.
So the fight for Pakistan wasn't just happening in political committees or drawing lines on maps. It was being fought deep down in people's minds.
Exactly.
Using these other kinds of weapons.
Yeah.
Myths, symbols, powerful images, legends, group pride, hero worship, all that stuff.
The psychological terrain we're digging into today, yeah.
Yeah.
Based directly on what Aziz lays out in this chapter.
So the core idea then, just to be clear, is nationalism isn't just ticking boxes, shared language, shared history.
Right, it's more than a checklist. Aziz argues it's fundamentally this spiritual feeling, a conviction, the tangible things, territory, group history, language, sure, they exist, they play a role.
But they're not enough on their own.
No, not on their own. They have to be sustained by this deep-seated belief, our faith is true, our patriotism is right, that kind of thing. The psychological factor, he's saying that's the bedrock. And sometimes it can actually outweigh the history or the culture. And again, you can't really use logic to dismantle someone's deeply felt conviction that they are separate.
And this psychological part, it became super important in India, according to the source. Why? Well, Aziz argues that both Muslim nationalism and Hindu or Indian nationalism,
Upsides, yeah.
when you measure them by what some theorists might call, normal standards for nationalism, like having one common language across the whole supposed nation, or a totally unified story about the past.
Things weren't quite that neat in India.
Exactly. It seemed like some of those key ingredients were, missing, or at least not universally shared across the subcontinent.
Precisely. So without those clear, universally agreed upon markers, the final, maybe the most decisive argument for people claiming nationhood became, purely psychological.
Right.
Like Aziz puts it, borrowing from Renan again. They felt that they were a nation. Therefore, they were a nation. Simple as that, almost.
Wow.
Which means the conflict in India, at its heart, was really a psychological contest, fought not with armies in the traditional sense, but fought in people's minds.
Using those unconventional weapons we mentioned.
Myths, symbols, images, legends, pride, hero worship, all tools in that psychological struggle.
Okay, so if the mind's the battlefield, how did these psychological weapons actually work? Let's start with myths and symbols. Aziz has a specific definition of myth here, right?
He does. It's not just pure fiction, not just made-up stories. He says it's got elements of both truth and untruth. It's like a compound of popular ideas, some based in reality, some fabricated or exaggerated over time.
Got it. And he identifies some major myths that were really influential back then in imperial India, shaping how people saw things.
Yeah, definitely. One big one was the myth of a homogeneous India, this idea of a single, unified Indian nation.
Okay.
Now, the Hindi perspective, as Aziz describes it, really passionately held on to this. They saw India as one country, one nation, and tended to view Muslims as, disruptive elements breaking that unity.
Right.
But the Muslim view completely rejected it, saw it as a figment of the Hindu imagination, I think is the phrase used. They basically believed that even if you could somehow argue an Indian nation existed, they weren't part of that nation.
And both sides use history to back this up.
Selectively, yes. Both sides went looking in the past and found the evidence that supported their view. So you had these two really powerful opposing myths just growing side by side, never really meeting or engaging.
You can see immediately how that creates a huge psychological divide, can't you? Just two totally different versions of reality existing at the same time.
Absolutely. Then there was another quite striking myth, the one about the exaggerated martial qualities of Indian Muslims.
Ah, the martial race idea.
Exactly. And Aziz points out this wasn't just something Muslims invented about themselves. It had, as he puts it, shared parentage. The British, Hindus, and Muslims all kind of fed into it.
How so?
Well, the British definitely spread the idea, partly maybe genuine belief of the stereotype of the meat-eating Muslim being the bravest fighter, partly to create a fighting Musalman bogeyman to maybe frighten Hindus a bit.
Ah, divide and rule tactics.
Potentially, yeah. And partly maybe just to balance things out communally within the army. Hindus, for their part, naturally tended to resent and fear this image being pushed.
And Muslims.
Muslims, well, remembering their own history of conquest in India, they largely accepted it, took pride in it even.
And the irony, Aziz says, is that this myth often just ignored the very real, strong martial traditions of other groups.
Completely. Like the Rajputs, the Gurkhas, Sikhs, certain Hindu communities. They all had strong fighting histories. But this specific myth about the Muslims as the martial race really took hold, added another layer of psychological complexity and probably confusion too.
Okay, what else?
Then there was a myth that was, according to Aziz, pretty much exclusively pushed by some Hindu nationalists. The idea that India inherently, fundamentally belongs to Hindus and that Muslims are basically foreigners.
Right, I've heard echoes of that.
Figures like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, they were prominent in promoting this. It sort of lumped Muslims and the British together, both seen as alien invaders who'd kind of desecrated India by conquering it.
But Aziz disagrees with that lumping.
Strongly. He calls it sophism-like, a clever but ultimately false argument. His key distinction is that Muslims had settled, they'd made India their home, largely disowned their places of origin over centuries. The British, on the other hand, came clearly as rulers, administrators, with no real intention of mixing, settling down permanently, becoming Indian.
That's a really important distinction. Invaders who stayed and became part of the fabric versus rulers who were always going to be separate and eventually leave.
Exactly. Then finally, there was this pervasive myth of the glorious past, a common feature of nationalism everywhere, really.
How did it play out here?
Hindus tended to look back to periods like the Mauryas or the Guptas as a kind of golden age. Muslims, on the other hand, often looked back to the Mughals, or sometimes even further back, to the glories of Islamic civilization outside India altogether.
And the point of recalling these pasts?
Pretty clear, really. Show your group's past greatness, give people a psychological boost, something to be proud of, and importantly, create a shared historical identity that draws people together, but crucially, draws them together within their own separate historical narrative.
So these myths weren't just idle stories.
Not at all. Aziz stresses they were taken very seriously by the elites and the ordinary people. This cultivation of pride in your own group's achievements, whether entirely real or slightly embellished, had two very clear psychological results. One, it pushed Hindus and Muslims further apart mentally. Two, it amplified the nationalism, the sense of separate identity within each group.
Okay, so myths create these separate mental worlds. What about symbols? How do they fit in?
Symbols were like the visible shorthand for these separate identities. Aziz defines a symbol pretty straightforwardly, something that represents or recalls something common to a group, a conventional sign like white for purity or a lion for courage that just sums up a whole load of associations.
And these played a big role in India, too.
A huge role in the psychological process of nation building, yes. Take the flag, for example.
Right.
Classic national symbol. Think about France, the intense feelings around the red flag versus the tricolor. In India, both Congress and the Muslim League had their own flags, which became deeply revered. So when the Congress tricolor started being flown over public buildings, say, during the provincial governments in the late 30s,
Muslims didn't see it as just an Indian flag.
no. According to Aziz, many Muslims saw it quite clearly as a symbol of impending Hindu domination, a sign of the coming Hindu Raj. That perception itself is incredibly powerful, psychologically speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. What other symbols?
Well, some symbols seemed almost designed, as Aziz puts it, to cut the Muslim adrift from the Hindu. Clothing, for instance, became a really obvious visual archer.
The caps.
Exactly. Hindu congressmen often wore the white khadi cap, the Gandhi cap. Muslim leaguers increasingly adopted the Karakuli cap, which quickly got nicknamed the Jinnah cap. You could literally tell someone's political and likely communal allegiance just by glancing at their headwear.
Wow. So visible.
And slogans did the same job verbally. Hindus might shout, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, victory to Mother India, or Vande Mataram, bow to the mother. Muslims would respond with Allah, O Akbar, God is greatest, or increasingly, Pakistan Zindabad, long live Pakistan.
Not just cheers, then. They're like mini manifestos.
Precisely. Concise expressions of fundamentally different loyalties, different visions for the future.
Were there other types of symbols?
Oh, yeah. Even things like the Organized Volunteer Corps. You had the Hindu RSS and the Deval Volunteers, and then the Muslim League National Guards and the Coxars. These weren't just clubs. They symbolized a more organized, sometimes militant expression of this psychological nationalism.
And even everyday things.
Even everyday things.
Yeah.
Aziz mentions how Hindus might start a letter with Om, while Muslims would inscribe Bismillah. Or just the very different architectural styles of temples and mosques constantly visually highlighting the religious divide.
It seems like these symbols were everywhere.
They were. And there were broader, more abstract symbols too, what Aziz calls institutional or memory symbols, like, Swiss neutrality or maybe German struggle being symbolic for those nations.
What were the Indian equivalents?
Well, they often got boiled down into just a few potent words or phrases. Ideas like Greater India or Akhand Hindustan, undivided India, coming from some Hindu nationalist perspectives. And then, starkly opposing that, the single word Pakistan from the Muslim League. These single words became incredibly powerful psychological symbols, basically summarizing entire conflicting national goals.
And Aziz argues these myths and symbols had immense psychological value.
Immense. They worked on intellectuals, they worked on the masses. Emotion, he notes, is always a huge ingredient in nationalism, maybe especially in societies where literacy isn't universal. These things might not always be strictly logical or rational.
But they hit people on a different level.
Exactly. They crystallized complex issues into something understandable, maybe even visceral. They acted like alarm bells, signaling perceived threats. They clearly pinpointed national objectives. Aziz says they provided welcome grist to the political mill, just incredibly useful tools for creating and then sustaining these competing nationalisms, almost like mass suggestion or auto-suggestion working on the collective mind.
Okay, so those are the tools myths and symbols used to build these separate identities. But what about the deeper feelings driving it all? Aziz points strongly to fear and insecurity, doesn't he?
He really does. He makes the point that group solidarity, feeling close to your people, often gets strongest when that group feels threatened.
Makes sense.
And in India, he argues, this feeling among many Muslims, the feeling that they weren't getting a fair deal from the Hindu majority, and crucially, the belief that they never would get a fair deal, this was a hugely powerful factor nurturing Muslim nationalism.
And he provides evidence for this feeling.
Yeah, some quite stark examples. There's a quote from Sir Fazl Hussain, a prominent Muslim politician in Punjab, basically saying that even a really capable non-communal Muslim wouldn't get the same opportunities or preference from non-Muslim leaders or the public simply because he was Muslim.
Even if competent and fair-minded.
Right. But even more revealing, I think, is the quote from Shukatullah Ansari. Now, this guy is described as a staunch congressman, a nationalist Muslim, someone really committed to the idea of a united India.
Okay, so not a separatist.
Not at all. Yet he's quoted saying that Hindus were often small-minded in the social field, that they treated Muslims like untouchables. And he says even he, a Puka nationalist, felt treated like an untouchable once people knew he was Muslim.
Wow. If someone that committed to unity felt that.
Exactly. Think about what that implies for how others, perhaps less invested in unity, must have felt. It really lands hard, that quote.
Yeah, it does. And Aziz says this feeling wasn't isolated?
No, he argues it was pervasive. You see it expressed by leaders, all the way from Sayyid Ahmad Khan back in the 19th century right up to Jinnah. It's echoed in Muslim League resolutions over decades. He goes so far as to call Pakistan the child of this feeling of insecurity.
The child of insecurity. That's powerful phrasing.
It is. He argues this basic lack of perceived national unity created constant tension, and the Muslim community felt increasingly like the victims of this tension. They felt the majority was imposing its views, leading towards ever greater oppression.
And did the Hindu leadership, particularly Congress, understand this fear?
Well, this is where Aziz is quite critical. He argues they actually made it worse through what he calls a muddle-headed attitude. He sees their failure to really take this deep Muslim feeling seriously as their greatest failure.
So a fundamental misunderstanding.
Seems so. He cites Jawaharlal Nehru, for example, for really underestimating the depth of Muslim feeling, sometimes even denying it existed, dismissing communal rivalry as just squabbling over jobs, the famous loaves and fishes argument. And Gandhi, too, is mentioned as being convinced the whole problem was artificial, kept alive only because the British, the third party, were there. He seemed to believe that if the British just left, everything would sort itself out between Hindus and Muslims.
Which, according to Aziz, was a major miscalculation.
A huge one. He says this refusal to face the reality of the deep psychological divide just prevented any genuine understanding of the Muslim viewpoint. And that failure, he argues, directly contributed to the eventual explosion, his word of partition.
So this dismissal from the top just fueled more suspicion.
Exactly. It led to this deep Muslim suspicion, a kind of defensive posture, haunted, as he says, by the fear of being dominated, eventually crushed by the sheer weight of the Hindu majority.
Where did this fear come from originally?
Aziz traces its roots back, partly to the post-mutiny period where Muslims felt suppressed by the British politically, partly to seeing Hindus gain ground in modern education and commerce, while many Muslims initially held back. Partly just the simple fact of being a minority. And partly, he suggests, a degree of self-imposed backwardness in adapting to modern life, a choice to live in the cloister, as he puts it.
Were there economic dimensions to this insecurity too?
Oh, definitely. A significant layer. Muslims often resented what they saw as Hindu control over the economy, business, trade, finance. They felt shut out.
Lacking their own institutions.
Pretty much. No major Muslim-owned banks, insurance companies, shipping lines, that kind of thing. And trying to break into fields dominated by established Hindu businesses was seen as really risky. Aziz notes there just wasn't a strong class of Muslim capitalists or economic leaders to challenge this near monopoly, at least not until very late in the day, and even then only on a small scale.
And then politically, the situation looked even more threatening, especially with democracy coming.
Right. The rise of democratic ideas and the principle of self-determination in the 20th century, paradoxically, these potentially liberating ideas seem to confirm Muslims' deepest fears.
How so? Democracy sounds good.
Well, think about it from a minority perspective in that context. Democracy, based on majority rule, presented the prospect of being a permanent, unchangeable minority, never being able to control the administration, always subject to the majority's will. Aziz calls this a chilling prospect and suggests it basically killed off any real enthusiasm among many Muslims for a single democratic Indian state.
And when they were accused of being undemocratic for resisting this.
That label, often thrown by Congress, according to Aziz, just reinforced their fears and sense of alienation.
What about self-determination? That sounds like it should help a group wanting separateness.
You'd think so, but it felt complicated in the Indian context. The world generally saw India as one single unit fighting for freedom from Britain. And Aziz argues Congress worked pretty hard to ensure that the world didn't know much about the specific phenomenon of Muslim nationalism within that larger Indian nationalism. They framed it as an internal issue or downplayed it.
So when Muslims tried to invoke self-determination for themselves,
they were often dismissed internationally, seen as just a troublesome minority making an unreasonable claim to nationhood, splitting the anti-colonial movement. Aziz concedes this probably damaged their cause and reputation on the world stage initially.
but internally.
Internally, he argues, it just hardened their resolve. It fueled their determination to achieve separation, to make the world recognize their claim.
So wrapping up this section on fear, Aziz concludes the real roots of separatism were psychological.
Absolutely. Deep in the minds of men, as he says. Politics, the negotiations, the demands, they were mostly just reflections of this underlying psychological reality, this deep-seated fear and insecurity. And this psychological force, he contends, is the key to understanding the extraordinary strength and speed of Muslim nationalism, how it could seemingly split the subcontinent in just 7 years after the formal demand for Pakistan was made.
Okay, so given this profound sense of insecurity, this feeling of being a threatened minority, Aziz lays out basically 3 paths that were theoretically open to Indian Muslims.
Right. As a national minority, what could they do? Path 1, look for help from outside, from co-religionists abroad. A bit like, say, the Sudeten Germans appealing to Nazi Germany before World War II.
Did Indian Muslims do that?
Interestingly, Aziz says no, not really in a practical political sense. Yes, there was strong emotional support for pan-Islam, for the Ottoman Caliphate, but they never seemed to pursue a strategy of asking foreign Muslim powers to intervene politically to protect their specific rights within India.
Okay, so path 1 wasn't taken. What was path 2?
Path 2 was to try and get special protections, privileges, safeguards from the majority group within India itself. He compares this to maybe the Catalans seeking autonomy within Spain pre-Franco.
And Muslims did try this.
Oh yes, very actively. This was the main strategy for decades, starting with the demand for separate electorates back in 1906, and continuing with constant demands for various safeguards, quotas, constitutional concessions.
Did they get him?
Many of them, yes. But here's the crucial point Aziz makes. Who granted these concessions? Overwhelmingly, it was the British rulers, not the Hindu majority leadership through Congress.
Ah, so the majority wasn't seen as willingly giving protections.
Exactly. This fact, Aziz argues, just further convinced many Muslims that the Hindu majority wasn't genuinely willing to safeguard their interests if left to their own devices. Plus, even when these safeguards were granted on paper, they often proved kind of toothless or ineffective in actual practice. So Muslims gradually lost faith in the second path, too.
Which leaves only path 3.
Path 3. Complete separation, break away entirely from the majority group.
And that's what the Lahore Resolution in 1940 represented.
Precisely, the formal demand for Pakistan. Aziz's argument boils down to this. All the previous attempts, safeguards, guarantees, negotiations, political promises, they all failed. Why? Because they couldn't touch the underlying psychological reality. They couldn't erode that deep suspicion and fear.
So the politics couldn't fix the psychology.
That's the core argument. The tension didn't lessen, the insecurity didn't decrease. If anything, irritation grew, the possibility of civil conflict seemed higher. The spirit of compromise just wasn't there. No bridge of understanding could be built because the psychological gulf, he concludes, was simply too wide and too deep by that point for any purely political device to span it.
So the creation of a separate state became the only perceived option left.
Yes, a state born with a nationalism that was, in Aziz's words, psychologically well-vested, meaning deeply rooted in that feeling, but also politically yet untried. A huge leap of faith, in a way.
It really emphasizes the psychological over the political mechanisms, doesn't it? Now, beyond fear, another way this psychological dimension showed up was in heroes, right? How groups define themselves through the figures they admire.
Absolutely. Aziz makes the point that having shared heroes is a strong indicator of a shared nationality, a social solidarity. The hero kind of embodies the group's common values, helps keep people together.
We see that in Western history, saints, kings, political leaders, war heroes.
Right. But in India, the picture was, again, one of sharp division. Hindus and Muslims had fundamentally different sets of heroes they looked up to.
So Hindi India revered figures like?
Well, Shivaji, the Maratha warrior king. Political leaders like Tilak, Aurobindo, Gandhi, Nehru. Going further back, historical figures like the emperors Asoka or Chandragupta Maurya. For Muslims, Aziz notes, these figures just didn't command the same loyalty or interest, sometimes even hostility.
And conversely, Muslim heroes were.
Figures like the religious reformer Shah Waliullah, the modernizer Sayyid Ahmad Khan, political leaders like Muhammad Ali Jauhar, and of course, Jinnah. And looking back into history, conquerors like Muhammad bin Qasim, who first brought Islam to Sindh, or Mahmud of Ghazni.
Figures who Hindus might see very differently.
Exactly. Hindus might detest Qasim as the first invader, or curse Mahmud for raiding temples. So the very figures one group revered, the other often viewed negatively.
What about rulers who governed both Hindus and Muslims, like the Mughals? Akbar, for instance.
Even there, the interpretations diverged sharply. Hindu historians, Aziz notes, often had a bit of a soft spot for Akbar. They saw him as a peacemaker, tolerant, trying to bridge the gap.
But Muslim historians?
They tended to reserve their highest praise for Aurangzeb, Akbar's great-grandson. They admired Aurangzeb for being pious, strictly adhering to Islamic law, a God-fearing ruler.
While Hindus might dislike Aurangzeb for that very orthodoxy.
Precisely. And conversely, some Orthodox Muslims disliked Akbar for what they saw as his religious unorthodoxy, his departure from strict Islamic principles. So even shared rulers became contested figures.
And Shivaji seems like a particularly clear example of this divide.
Absolutely. For many Hindus, he was idolized a liberator, founder of Maratha power, a symbol of resistance against Mughal rule. For Muslims, though, he was often viewed as simply an enemy, an inveterate foe of Muslim power. And they'd often point to incidents like his killing of the Muslim general Afzal Khan, arguing it was done through deception, as proof of his negative character.
So different heroes, completely different narratives about the same historical figures, all reinforcing separate identities.
Constantly reinforcing those separate, sometimes even antagonistic identities by looking at the past through completely different lenses.
And speaking of looking at the past, Aziz talks about history writing itself as being a powerful factor, often a divisive one.
Yes. He points out that how a nation writes its history, its philosophy of history, often gets tangled up with its nationalism. National bias in history writing is pretty common everywhere, let's be honest.
True.
And history recounting battles, invasions, periods of rule, cultural achievements, it's often explicitly used to build pride and national unity, to foster that national feeling.
And this happened in India.
Very much so. He argues the growth of nationalist sentiment, both Hindu and Muslim, directly affected how history was written. Hindu historians, for example, started placing more emphasis on heroic struggles against Muslim rulers, glorifying figures like the Rajputs or the Marathas, sometimes perhaps downplaying their flaws or controversial actions, like with Shivaji.
And did historical writing change over time?
Aziz suggests it mirrored the changing political climate. In the 1920s, during the Khilafat movement, when there was a push for Hindu-Muslim unity, historical writing sometimes reflected that, emphasizing shared culture or moments of cooperation.
But later.
By the 1930s, you see more acknowledgement of the differences, the polarity, though maybe still with some hope for political cooperation. But by the 1940s, as the demand for Pakistan grew, historical accounts on both sides increasingly stressed separate political achievements, separate cultural contributions, separate destinies. The rift became really apparent in the history being written.
Did Muslim historians contribute much in this modern period?
This is a point where Aziz is quite critical, actually. He finds it a pity, he says, that Muslims who were once masters of historical writing in India produced relatively little significant historical work in the modern period, especially concerning their own history in India.
Why was that, according to him?
Some excused it by saying Muslim scholars were more focused on events in the wider Muslim world, but Aziz kind of dismisses that, saying there wasn't a huge amount of work being done on those areas either. He mentions a few notable contributions, like Amir Ali's work on Islam globally or Shafat Ahmad Khan writing about the constitutional developments, but feels they were somewhat limited.
So what was the impact of this relative lack of Muslim historical writing?
Well, historians everywhere tend to exalt their own people, their own civilization. He gives the example of Italian scholars focusing on the glories of Rome. Muslim historians might look to the broader Islamic past or the Mughal era, but if there's a scarcity of modern scholarship from within the community.
Then who tells the story?
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the books being written. History teachers, Aziz emphasizes, are also crucial agents of nationalism.
How so?
They glorify their own nationality in the classroom. They use biographies of national heroes. They select historical events that emphasize national glory. They offer interpretations that align with prevailing national ideals. Both Hindu and Muslim teachers did this, naturally.
But if there were fewer Muslim history scholars and works?
Then the paucity, as Aziz calls it, meant that often even the periods of Muslim role in Indian history ended up being taught using textbooks written by Hindu authors or lectured on by Hindu professors. This could subtly, or maybe not so subtly, embed a particular narrative, a particular perspective in the minds of students, including Muslim students.
That's a really interesting point about who controls the narrative in education.
Yeah.
Now, moving from specific histories to something broader, the idea of national character. Aziz finds this concept a bit tricky.
Yeah, he acknowledges it's a deceptive idea because there's so much variety within any large group of people. He suggests maybe terms like national traditions or national mentality might be better.
But he still thinks there's something there.
Yes, the core point for him is that groups do develop distinguishing traditions, shared interests, common ideals that set them apart from others.
And in India, despite similarities.
Right. He explicitly notes that despite commonalities like, say, a Punjabi Hindu and a Punjabi Muslim might look very similar, share regional customs. He argues there was still a manifest difference in their outlook on life. He talks about a kind of constellation of forces making up Muslim characteristics that gave them a sense of unity and fixity, shaping their image both for themselves and for Hindus, an image that transcended those shared regional things.
So maybe similar on the surface, but different underneath.
Kind of. He describes how urban, educated Hindus and Muslims might appear quite similar in public, living in the same areas, studying together, maybe even dressing similarly when outside the home.
But at home,
Big differences. In what they ate, their specific religious practices, how they dressed privately, the newspapers they read, their political leanings, and especially in crucial social institutions surrounding things like marriage and death customs. He argues they operated with different values in different cultural environments, drawing on different traditions and holding different ideals for life.
and the key thing wasn't just the difference, but the feeling of difference.
That's crucial for Aziz. It wasn't just that objective differences existed, but that they felt they had different ideals. This powerful, subjective feeling of being different, of not sharing the things that mattered most deeply, that's what fundamentally directed their political views and actions.
So national character or national mentality is mainly psychological.
Predominantly, yes, a psychological sentiment. The Muslim, Aziz argues, came to think he had a mind different from the Hindu mind. And when an entire community comes to believe this about itself, well, then the Muslim nation, at least in spirit, was effectively born. Time and the lack of deep assimilation between the communities only served to confirm this belief, making it feel less like an opinion and more like an article of faith.
And this feeling, this belief in being fundamentally different, was constantly undermining any attempts at unity.
Yes, gnawing at the vitals of unity is his phrase. He argues that if distinct groups living together genuinely believe they don't belong together, that they aren't part of the same people, then trying to force them into a single nation is almost impossible, or at least creates a very unstable, temporary situation. Multinational states need some strong, glue-shared political ideals, mutual respect, something otherwise they're inherently rickety.
Were attempts made to create that glue in India?
Oh, certainly. Aziz acknowledges the numerous negotiations, particularly between 1916 and 1944, aimed at finding a political settlement. And the British themselves introduced various systems, local self-government, separate electorates, constitutional safeguards, and especially the Government of India Act of 1935, which were often presented, at least partly, as tools or potential foundations for some kind of unified or at least cooperative structure.
What about the 1935 Act specifically? That was meant to be a big step towards self-government.
It was. And Aziz notes that it actually recognized the lack of unity by proposing a federal structure, trying to balance power between the center and provinces and between communities. He even speculates that it might have potentially worked, maybe, if it had been implemented fully and in a spirit of genuine goodwill from all sides.
But it wasn't.
Well, the federal part never fully came into effect because of the war and disagreements, and crucially, Aziz suggests the spirit wasn't really there. He poses the hypothetical question: could a multinational India have survived even if the 1935 Act had worked perfectly as designed?
And his answer.
He seems doubtful. He suggests that perhaps by 1937, when the provincial points of the Act came into force, the psychological rift, that deep feeling of separateness, might have already gone too far, too deep for any political or constitutional arrangement to successfully bridge it. Which brings us right back to that crucial question of when exactly that feeling of insecurity tipped over into a firm belief in the necessity of separation. And that, he says, links directly to the final, perhaps most important psychological element: national consciousness.
Right, national consciousness. This seems like the culmination of all these psychological factors we've been discussing. Aziz draws on other thinkers here.
He does. He mentions Robert Michels, who argued that the real essence of nationality isn't just shared blood or language, but above all, the will of a people, this common desire to live together, to belong together, that kind of transcends all the other components.
And Hans Kohn.
Kohn emphasized that while nationality might have roots in history, language, whatever, it's the consciousness, the awakening of that feeling, the active decision to form a nationality that makes it real, makes it absolute.
And Aziz sees Muslim nationalism in India fitting this model perfectly.
To an extraordinary degree, yes. He argues it wasn't just some automatic result of sharing Islam or having a common history in India. It was fundamentally the product of consciousness. The sheer power of an idea, a spiritual drive, was what truly shaped it. Without that widespread national consciousness developing, he argues, the idea of separation would never have become strong enough to demand and ultimately achieve a whole new state.
It's not a simple process, though, developing that consciousness.
No, it's complex. It involves a group becoming aware of itself, building solidarity, finding the links that unite its members, defining its goals. And it's not uniform. Some people might have a very clear ideology, others just a vague sense of unease or difference.
But the key first step is?
The key first step is that consciousness arising where members believe they belong to one distinct nationality. Now, Aziz is careful to clarify. This doesn't mean every single individual Muslim agreed, or that the Muslim League spoke for literally everyone. There were Muslims who were indifferent, who disagreed, who didn't care about Pakistan.
But enough did.
Enough did. The national will, he says, needed to be shared by a great majority for that consciousness to become politically potent. It didn't need to be universal, but it needed critical mass.
And what fuels this consciousness, this collective will? Aziz mentions 3 motives from Frederick Hertz.
Yes. Traditions, interests, and ideals. Traditions connect the group to its past. The shared heritage, the collective memories, the values passed down.
Right.
Interests connect the group to the present, the practical things needed for survival, well-being, security, freedom from perceived threats. What's useful for the group right now?
And ideals.
Ideals connect the group to the future. These are the higher aims, the big aspirations that inspire people, command loyalty, make them willing to sacrifice what the group wants to become or achieve.
So, Muslim national consciousness developed when Muslims became aware of these 3 things for themselves.
Exactly. When they became collectively aware of their shared traditions and heritage, whether specifically Indian Muslim history or broader Islamic history, when they became aware of their perceived common interests, like safety from domination, freedom to practice their religion, group prestige, and when they became aware of their shared ideals, what kind of future they wanted, that awareness is national consciousness.
And this consciousness then solidified into specific aspirations. Aziz identifies 4 key ones.
He does. 4 things that really crystallize what Muslim nationalism was aiming for: unity, liberty, individuality, and prestige.
Let's break those down quickly. Unity.
Unity meant Muslims seeing themselves primarily as one single political community, bound by common ideas and heritage, transcending regional or linguistic differences within the Muslim population.
And liberty.
Liberty was crucial. It meant not just freedom from British rule, everyone wanted that, but specifically, for Muslims, liberation from the perceived threat of Hindu domination or interference in a future independent India. Freedom from, as well as freedom for.
Individuality.
This was the strong assertion of their separateness, their distinctness, the core belief: we are fundamentally different from Hindus, we have our own unique identity.
And finally, prestige.
Prestige meant securing honor, dignity, influence for the community, not being treated as just a subordinate or helpless minority. Ideally, gaining that respect within a united India, but if that wasn't possible, then achieving it within their own separate state.
So these 4 aspirations, unity, liberty, individuality, prestige, they really capture the driving force.
For Aziz, yes. They crystallize the psychological energy behind Muslim nationalism, he reiterates. It wasn't enough just to share a religion or aspects of history. The people had to become conscious of their past and their desired future, deeply aware of their perceived individuality, and above all, they had to believe they were different.
And that belief.
That belief, he concludes, became the hard core, the thing that was almost impossible to challenge through rational argument or political negotiation. You could debate historical interpretations, you could argue about linguistic unity, you could discuss political structures.
But you can't argue with faith.
You cannot argue with faith.
Yeah.
And by the 1940s, Aziz suggests this belief in Muslim separateness had essentially attained the status of faith for a critical mass of people.
So, pulling all these threads together from Chapter 6, K.K. Aziz is making a really strong case here, isn't he? That underneath all the politics, the negotiations, the historical debates we often focus on, the deepest roots of Muslim separatism, the real engine driving it, lay in this psychological realm, in these shared feelings, these collective beliefs, the myths they told themselves, the fears that haunted them, and ultimately this powerful national consciousness built on the conviction of being different.
It definitely forces you to look beyond just the surface events. And it raises a really important question, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to ponder. If nationalism, when it's really potent, is fundamentally this state of mind, this collective belief in separateness that feels as strong as faith, well, how do you even begin to bridge that kind of psychological gulf?
Yeah.
Aziz suggests the political fixes, the constitutional devices, they ultimately failed in India because that feeling, that psychological reality, had just become too strong, too deeply ingrained to be overcome by political engineering.
And here's where it gets really interesting, thinking about it not just as history. It makes you consider the immense power of collective belief, of identity, of perceived difference in shaping political realities even today, right? In conflicts and situations all around the world.
Absolutely. It has contemporary relevance for sure. And maybe the thought to leave you with, drawing directly from Aziz's conclusion in this chapter. When you encounter that hard core of nationalism, that profound, deeply felt belief that we are different, you can debate facts, you can discuss policies, you can argue ideology.
Right.
But as Aziz concludes, you simply cannot argue with faith.
A truly powerful thought to mull over. Join us next time on The Deep Dives as we continue to unpack the complex layers of the making of Pakistan.